Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is episode 84 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm Ben Eagle. Now, I don't often ask this because it makes me cringe when other podcasters ask, but I know it's important, so I'm going to, and I apologise in advance. But please, 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 whether you're listening on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or somewhere else entirely, please do subscribe, and if you're feeling really generous, leave a small comment. I cannot tell you how much that helps in growing the podcast and getting more people involved. Right, self-publicity over. Let's take a look at some of the news stories from the past week. In the news this week, sugar beet is in the farming news again, with France the latest country to join others, including Spain, Poland and Belgium, in a derogation for growers to be able to use neonicotinoids on sugar beet. DEFRA maintains that a ban will remain for UK growers, and with an increase in the amount of tariff-free sugarcane allowed into the country, beet growers are concerned. Sticking in Europe, African swine fever is moving close to the UK, with several large herds now affected in Poland, close to the German border. 19 outbreaks have been recorded in Poland in the last 10 days of July, and there are also cases in Latvia, Romania and Russia. The APHA is continuing to monitor the situation. There's been some good news for potato growers supplying McCain, who are offering grants to their growers as part of a £25 million investment package to help secure supply following a number of challenging seasons. The grants will be able to be used to buy machinery and other equipment. McCain buy about 15% of the total UK yield of potatoes. Meanwhile, in the dairy world, there's good news for first milk producers, whose September milk price will rise by 0.5 pence per litre. And that is the news for now. In the news. It's now time for our main feature interview of the week, and it's with a non-farmer this time, indeed a forester, and we're talking about trees. Meet the farmer's friends. So tonight we're talking about a subject that many view as the opposite of farming, the opposite land use to farming, and that is forestry, trees. With increased interest, though, in mixing agri and forestry systems, not least in agroforestry, I thought it was important to focus on this subject for a bit. Is it viable, say, to integrate trees into your farming system? I'm really pleased to be joined tonight by today's guest, who contacted me after Rob York's episode, Luke Hemmings. Welcome, Luke. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really, really good to have you on here. So Luke's had a diverse career, all based around trees, forests and wood-related subjects. He's currently Woodland Officer for Durham, the North East and Northumberland for the Forestry Commission, although I should say he's speaking in a personal capacity tonight. He's worked within the private and public sectors as an agent, contractor, sawmiller and forest manager, and he's currently tasked with promoting and enforcing government policy on good forestry and woodland management through a mixture of regs, incentives, partnership working and communication across the North East, which is, at the moment, it's probably one of the most active regions for new woodland creation. So tonight we're going to be talking about woodland and trees generally, but also specifically in a farming context. Luke, thanks for coming on the show. Forestry it's always seen as a bit of a niche, really, that doesn't involve farmers. And I'd also be interested tonight to hear your view from a forester's perspective as to whether you sort of look on agri like that. But a lot of farmers turn their back on it, even though on lots of estates or farms, small farms as well, there will be areas of trees, areas of woodland on it. But why do you think it's important that farmers begin to think about trees more?
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for that introduction. And it's really great to be here. I'm really excited to be talking to your listeners about woods and trees. I think this has become a bit of a sort of passion project of mine really, because I feel like we're all in our own little worlds during our kind of working lives, and it's very much the same for farmers as well. They've got very busy lives, very hectic lives. It's we don't have a lot of time for thinking outside our comfort zone and thinking about things which maybe aren't forming the bulk of our everyday work.
Yeah.
So it's quite easy to sort of leave certain areas aside and say, well, that's maybe not my forte, or we can use a specialist to deal with that, if at all. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I mean, there is a lot of forestry that I've come to learn about, over the years, which there's no way that I would know the kind of depth and breadth of it if I was just doing it as a one part of a wider business, for example. But I do think it's worth having a vague understanding from a point of view of seeing what it can do for your business, apart from what it can do for the environment and other other aspects around you. And I think this is going to become more and more important as we move into the kind of ELMS grant system, and both for existing woodland that farmers may already have on their holdings, and also for the potential for new woodland creation, because obviously we've lost a lot of our woodland cover over the last few hundreds and thousands of years. We've gained some of it back in the more recent past, but we're still kind of behind the rest of Europe.
Tell me about where you live and work. What's it like up there?
Well, I'm obviously based in the northeast, as you mentioned earlier. So I'm originally from Newcastle, which you might not be able to tell. I am
really,
in fact a Geordie. Yeah, but having spent a fair while away from there, I haven't really kept the accent. But I now live in sort of rural Northumberland, not far from Hexham.
Amazing.
Which is kind of Hadrian's Wall country, and it's a mix really. There's a lot of livestock farms, obviously a bit of arable, not so much sort of fruit and veg. I suppose it's more kind of upland farming. A few more kind of specialist businesses, like there's a large tree nursery near me, and obviously forestry. Being in Northumberland, we've got Kielder Forest, we've got, which is probably the most famous, but lots of other kind of forestry areas as well, and some big wood using businesses like Egger in Hexham, which makes chipboard, and then we've got some various other large sawmills dotted around. So there's a good market for timber products.
Tell me about your life growing up. Did you always have an interest in trees?
I think I did. I did come from a sort of city background, but I did spend a lot of time outdoors growing up, and I actually moved to Hexham when I was about 13, and became friends with a few of the farmers I went to school with, and kind of realized that the countryside wasn't what I'd sort of come to believe growing up, that it was all kind of just cows and hedgerows and not a lot else really. Kind of learned there was a lot more to it. And I actually ended up going and working on farms in New Zealand. When I finished studying, I went to New Zealand for 6 months. Okay. And I worked on organic farms over there, doing this kind of volunteering, a few paid jobs, but got more of a feel probably for farming over there in a different way, and really came back with an appreciation for kind of working in the outdoors, and really decided that I didn't want an office job.
Yeah.
Ironically, as I spend most of my time now sat behind a desk. But actually discovered while I was in New Zealand that there was a career in trees and forestry. It wasn't something that was really taught at school or ever brought up, even studying geography or something like that.
Was there a moment, was there a time when you thought, what, I really want this to be my career?
Yeah, I think it was a friend of mine, well, my best friend, kind of oldest friend growing up, went and studied arboriculture. So obviously much more individual trees close to people, houses and things like that, tree surgery. And it's maybe a distinction that's worth making, because I still get a lot of people asking me now, oh, you're a forester, oh, so you're a tree surgeon, sort of thing. There's still a lot of confusion. Forestry as a practice, I suppose, is much more about managing forest as a whole, and particularly in the sense of producing timber, I suppose. Whereas arboriculturalists are more kind of focused on individual trees and tree health.
And you did your student placement nearer me, certainly, than you are now, at Thetford Forest.
Yes, that was fantastic. So at the time, the Forestry Commission were doing kind of student placement. So part of your degree was to go and spend a year working in industry and kind of learn the ropes a bit more. And I was posted down in Thetford in East Anglia, which is kind of totally different environment that I was used to. I don't think I'd ever been to Norfolk at that point. But it was really interesting, and there were definitely some similarities in the kind of people that I met and things, very welcoming people once you kind of got past the initiation stage. I think for anyone who's kind of working on land-based things, but also anything where it's kind of more of an applied skill, I think it's really important to have that experience out in the field, and learn what is and isn't kind of feasible, what's come before you. I think we all have a tendency to think we've got all the answers, particularly when we start out in something, and quite often there's some very wise people that have been before you who might be able to sort of show you a thing or two.
Yeah.
So I certainly found that, and it was very formative and really kind of helped me develop a good work ethic and get used to early starts and long days and things like that.
Yeah.
Out in the woods.
Let's turn towards those changes. Obviously, in ag, we're facing a lot of change at the moment, the prospect of that. And as those conversations have happened and are happening, certainly with the ELMS consultation, which first stage closed last month, trees are and have been a big part of that. But traditionally, I suppose there's been a feeling that, I'm not sure whether threatened is the right word, but farmers have maybe been a bit apathetic as well. Maybe there's just not been an awareness that actually trees are seen as fundamentally not part of agriculture, even though there are lots of farmers out there who grow perennial crops, which are technically, I suppose, in many ways, it could be tied into that sort of system. But there's more talk and engagement with agroforestry, for example. But do you think that, I'm going to use that word, do you think that farmers feel threatened by forestry or woodland creation at the moment or traditionally?
That's certainly the impression that I get in some quarters. I wouldn't say universally. I think there's obviously different degrees of interest and awareness of what's happening with, sort of changes afoot. I think some people definitely see it as an opportunity, and forestry's performed really well as a kind of investment over the last few years. So that's been part of what's driven the renewed interest. But then we've also got the kind of political forces coming, through our commitments to net zero, and the current government's targets for planting 11 million trees, I think was the target, which has now been converted into an area. But there's lots of interest, and I think it is difficult if you're on the ground. It's hard to see how these changes are going to affect you when there's no kind of clear view at the moment of how we're going to get there. And that's part of what the current consultation on the England tree strategy is about, which is still open until early September, I think. So, as has been happening with the agriculture review, there's an ongoing consultation into trees and woodland, and it's really important that people make their views heard of how they feel trees and woods can work for them, because it shouldn't be a threat. I think there's lots of different situations traditionally where perhaps sort of larger estates might have had more of a forestry interest. They might have kept the forestry separate from the farms anyway, so maybe the farmers didn't actually get involved in the forestry side of things. They might have kept that in-house for all sorts of reasons. But I think going forward, it does make sense that things are more kind of integrated. So hopefully if farmers can pick up a few skills along the way and a bit of knowledge, then that should help them to identify opportunities. And on most farms that I've been to, there's normally like a field or a bit of ground that actually they don't really like farming very much. So there may be opportunities within the existing farm that are kind of obvious, or it may be a case of finding ways to increase woodland alongside an existing farm business. I don't think anybody's really wanting to say, I think we all recognize the importance of farming and food production, particularly now. I think we're just encouraging people to maybe think a bit more widely and think, well, actually forestry can deliver quite a lot. People are going to be expected to do more with their land than just produce food, as important as that is. There are going to be kind of incentives to diversify, and it could be in it could be in a smaller scale. So the current grants system, people don't seem to realize, starts off from kind of 0.1 of a hectare. You could be planting areas of woodland as small as 0.1 of a hectare,
Yeah.
if it's delivering benefits for water quality. And things like water are going to just be even more and more important going forward. So water retention, preventing runoff. I think people think about trees as being something that could that will use more water, and that they might be counterproductive for a drought situation, but actually they can help prevent soils being desiccated and blown away and that kind of thing. So there's some
Absolutely,
really
and
good examples
I think
of that.
this is a really good, it's a really important conversation actually to have, especially in the light of this year. Think back to that winter, the winter that we've just come from, into that incredibly dry May. Certainly in
Yeah.
East Anglia, less so in other parts of the world, but
Yeah.
generally it's been much drier. And then you look at
Yeah.
certainly into harvest this year, and from a farming point of view, this is a little bit of a wake-up call into if this is more of the kind of thing that we're going to be facing in future. What are the what are the potential benefits of integrating trees within that sort of scenario?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but there are people who've started, integrating trees and arable systems. I mean, Stephen Briggs is the one that you'll probably know about,
Yeah,
who's
of course.
kind of constantly making the rounds and trying to
A former Meet the Farmers
encourage
guest.
people. Yes. But I mean, in his situation, again, very dry East Anglia soils. I think the principle is about slowing down the wind and also providing a bit of shade on the soil, and also having the tree roots, which go much deeper, helping with water infiltration and helping to replenish, water tables and things like that when the rain is actually there. So it's not as simple as there's a tree that's going to soak up water and take it away from my crops. As we get into those situations, and I think there's great examples across Europe as well. I think France has been much more proactive in developing these systems, and there's probably a lot that we can learn from that. In my my experience, in my sort of situation, it would be much more around animal welfare and potential health of livestock, having access to shelter both in the winter but increasingly in the summer, and having access to different types of browsing.
Obviously, we're doing it now, but why do you think it's important to talk about trees to people who aren't foresters?
Well, I can only speak for myself, really, and I'm certainly wouldn't say I'm quite there yet in terms of getting the message out there, but I am making an effort to try and go out into the wider world and talk to people about trees and woodlands. And I think farming has kind of led the way almost. We're sort of trying to play catch up a bit, because
That's nice
I
to
think
hear.
farmers realized this a few years ago, that actually people are really interested to hear what you've got to say, and they want to know where their food comes from, and they want to know the people behind it.
Farmers aren't known for setting the agenda normally, so that's
well it's been a great success story then, really. If you think about the types of things that we've seen over the last few years, and I think the interest is genuine, and people are wanting to know where their food comes from. And the amount of people who are interested in the sort of potential US trade deal of kind of food standards and things like that, it was huge.
Yeah, amazing.
Huge success by the NFU for kind of pulling that together. I think people are interested in knowing about trees and woodlands. They feel really passionate about them, understandably. I feel passionate about them too. That's why I work with them. But there's a lot of misconceptions, as I mentioned before. We often go back to the sort of old arguments and damage that was done in the sort of 70s and 80s, and even earlier, sort of after the Second World War, really, or after the First World War, when domestic timber was almost completely depleted, I think woodland cover was down to like 4% or something like that, immediately after the First World War. I think there's a real disconnect at the moment between what people want, in terms of, they might go to IKEA and buy some new furniture, or buy a house which has got a timber frame, or have a wood-fired stove in their house or something like that, and then not understanding the sort of process of how that wood has reached them, or even that it is wood in the first place. It's a very taken for granted in some ways, I think, that the amount of wood that we use every day, and it needs to come from somewhere. And I think we need to be really clear about the message around sort of sustainable forestry practices and sustainable forest management, because there are some very strict regulations in place, which I kind of help to enforce in my day job as a woodland officer, around sort of felling licenses, environmental impact assessments, illegal felling, that kind of thing. And people need to understand that when they see a tree being cut down, it's not necessarily a kind of act of environmental vandalism. It's hopefully part of a bigger plan, a much longer term plan of what's going to happen in that area. And hopefully that wood will be going to a useful end use, and new trees will be planted in its place, or will grow in its place.
Obviously, over the last generation, we've had policy change, we've had economic change, so there's been changes of products. The climate is changing as well. How has, in terms of national tree cover, I suppose, how has species composition changed or changing? And that also relates to disease as well, which there have been some quite infamous, I'd say, specific species diseases in recent years.
Yeah, so in terms of composition, it's really not what people might expect. Certainly in the last sort of 20, 30 years, the vast majority of new woodland that's been created has been native, really since the sort of early 90s.
Okay.
The interest has been in native woodland, and it's only recently that there's been kind of renewed interest in creating new forests with timber production in mind. And that's partly because we can see that as we cut down sort of formerly productive woodlands and replace them with native trees, and part of that's because we're sort of restoring woodlands that might have been planted. So there might be sort of ancient woodlands that were then planted with conifers after one of the wars, or they might have just been areas that were originally planted as conifers, and now people would prefer to see them go back to broadleaves. We can see this sort of tailing off of production sort of coming down the line. So given that we already import 80% of our timber that we use in this country,
wow,
which is the sort of second highest in the world behind China, obviously there's a lot of people, myself included, who feel like we should be doing more to make sure that doesn't go in the wrong direction, that we ought to be producing more of our own timber rather than importing more. And there's lots of reasons for that. Environmental reasons being one of them. Does it make sense to be importing timber from across the world? And also, what controls do we have over, what's happening in the Amazon or in Siberia or somewhere like that? Some of that timber is obviously coming from managed forests elsewhere, so sort of Scandinavia and Canada and places like that might have sort of similar controls that we do. But I think we can all see that there's benefits for producing stuff closer to home and being less dependent on other countries producing it for us where possible, if we can do it well, and we can grow timber really well in this country, certainly for what we need. And I guess the other part of that is, the disease thing does kind of come into that, because, quite often diseases can be brought in on imported products, whether it's seedlings or, whether it's timber itself.
Obviously, Isabella Tree's book seems to have just captured the imagination of the entire country, it seems, at the moment. And rewilding has reached audiences everywhere. It's not often that anything to do with the countryside or land actually reaches that kind of spectrum. But everyone's talking about rewilding. Where does rewilding sit with forestry, with woodland? Because it's seen. I'm gonna use Wales as the example, simply because I know that Rewilding Britain had to pull out of their Summit to the Sea project, and there's been a lot of tension, let's say that, between farming, the idea of farming, and the idea of rewilding. How does forestry sit with rewilding? And has that debate been had to the same extent that it's been had in farming circles?
Not to the same extent, I don't think yet. But it is certainly a question that we're kind of often asked: is kind of why don't you support natural regeneration or natural colonization in the same way that you would support tree planting? And people quite often take issue with the term tree planting, because it suggests that's the only way to establish a woodland is by sort of directly planting trees rather than letting it happen naturally. I think there is scope for it to be used more. I mean, we already encourage natural regeneration. Coppicing is natural regeneration.
Yep.
Quite often when an existing forest is felled, natural regeneration will be part of how it's recolonized. So it's not that we don't use it already. I think the recognition is that it's going to be part of the answer. But as with farming, we have a limited land resource, and we're trying to get the most out of it we can in order to feed the country. And the same with forestry and timber. We want to try and produce the best that we can to supply the demand, and through intelligent design and intelligent restocking and management and kind of conscientious management, I think a lot of the same objectives can be achieved. And actually, in managed forests, there's already great examples of wildlife making the most of the environments that are there, simply because humans have been managing forests for millennia, and there are lots of species that have adapted to coexist quite happily in that environment.
I want to talk about carbon funding and the carbon credit system, which is, I suppose, let's look in the crystal ball and say that, in a changing climate, the importance of carbon credits is going to become more prominent in future. For any farmers out there who don't know, or anyone else listening, what are carbon credits and what are the opportunities?
So I'm by no means an expert in this subject, but very loosely, carbon funding is a company or an individual purchasing the carbon which your trees are going to be storing during their lifespan, during their life cycle. So the way that that's recorded is kind of independently verified. So you have somebody come and actually measure the trees as they're growing to make sure that they're locking up the amount of carbon that you've predicted that they're going to. And basically you get paid in intervals, usually every 5 years, through the lifespan of a project. And it can just help to make a project which otherwise wouldn't happen because it's maybe not as economical. Actually, in those environments where maybe the land is more productive, maybe it's more productive farmland, but there's a good argument for having more trees in that landscape. It could sort of help to meet that loss in income, the sort of income foregone that you would lose from giving up the land for farming and converting it to forestry, and then obviously the long sort of time lag before you start to produce an income again from those trees. There's a few different mechanisms for doing it. There has been, up until recently, it's been a sort of a fairly limited pool of people that you could go to if you wanted to sell your carbon, but the Forestry Commission have recently introduced a scheme which is sort of a government-backed purchasing scheme. So you put in a bid basically to sell your carbon to the government, and then if somebody offers more money further on down the line, then you're allowed to sort of buy out of the agreement and sell it on to someone else. But that's been completely oversubscribed. The last auction was kind of vastly oversubscribed. So it's a growth area really, and lots of companies are now looking at this because of their commitments to the Kyoto protocols and things like that, and needing to be net zero by 2050. So there's kind of increasing interest and people interested in doing more of the kind of ecosystem services and kind of bringing those together as well.
Let's turn to elms, and there is almost unbelievably still an immense lack of clarity on where we're going. It's quite bizarre in many ways. But anyway, that aside, without going into detail of the agri side of that, is this a massive opportunity for woodlands, forestry, trees?
I mean, I'm obviously biased on that question. I can't see how it can't be. When you look at the sort of various criteria in the 25-year environment plan, because this is what this is all about delivering. In terms of clean air, clean water,
Yeah.
Landscape, sustainability. I'm going to run out of things that I can remember to quote from the 25-year environment plan, but the point is it delivers against sort of multiple objectives, and apart from the fact that it's something that's different to what people are going to be doing already, I can't see why having a small area of woodland or even a significant area of woodland as part of a wider land using business would not be a benefit. And particularly when you start to think about the other kind of knock-on benefits that it would have, not just thinking about it commercially, but thinking about the environment and those payments for ecosystem services. So thinking about buffer strips, shelter belts, and then, on top of all of that, it's another source of income in terms of, producing timber at some stage. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I'm obviously quite biased on the subject. And I know that in it's not going to be the answer in all situations, and there might be differing scales. To a farmer in the uplands, maybe 10 hectares, 20 hectares of woodland might not seem like a huge amount to sort of convert to forestry, but for someone in the lowlands or maybe a smaller, a small holding, that kind of situation, it's going to be a huge commitment. So just even 1 or 2 hectares, even if the farm already has a biomass boiler or something like that, having a 2 hectare sweet chestnut coppice, or maybe that's not the best example, something that's going to grow quickly and provide wood to help heat the farm could be a great investment. So there's lots of different situations, and I would say, if you are thinking about this and thinking about the future, it's worth talking to your local woodland officer, because they can really advise you on the sort of the breadth of the options that are available at the moment, and many of those will carry on being supported.
2 final questions, which have become the new questions that I ask everyone at the end. First one is a message to the public. What would it be?
I think my general message to the public is, the next time you kind of buy a bit of IKEA furniture or sit down to use the toilet, to be crass, or buy a new kitchen worktop or something like that, just think about where that wood has come from. The likelihood is it hasn't come from a sort of pristine and managed oak woodland. It's probably come from a sustainably managed, hopefully UK grown, softwood forest. And there's a whole countryside full of foresters and forest managers and contractors and operatives kind of out there kind of working away to make sure that you can have those materials available to you for your next DIY project or whatever it might be. We're not the bad guys. We're not trying to destroy the environment. We're trying to look after it and make sure that it'll continue, and it's in our best interest to make sure that the woodlands are managed sustainably and there's something to be harvested in future.
Brilliant. And a message to farmers, specifically UK farmers, I suppose, but if there are any international farmers out there, maybe you can message to them as well.
I think it's basically just don't be a stranger. I think our interests don't have to clash. I think they really can go kind of hand in hand. I hope I've kind of demonstrated that in some ways. I'm incredibly in awe of what the farming community does all the time. I think we've got a lot to learn from you, as I said, in terms of communication and spreading our message. Just think about the different options that might be available to you. If you're thinking about changing what you're doing on the farm, or just having some different ideas, not sure what the future might hold, then reach out, have a chat. We're always happy to talk to you, and we might have some ideas for what you could be doing differently or in addition to what you're already doing.
Brilliant. Luke, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that I hope that listeners are going to get a lot from it, and it's really nice just to be broaching these conversations, and bringing, I mean, this podcast is partly what I want it to be about, is all about bringing different groups in the countryside together. So thank you so much for giving us your thoughts on such a wide area.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me, and I hope I've done the subject justice. There is a lot to cover, as you say, and people can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram or anything like that, or send me an email. And it's been great talking to you, and hopefully we can do this again in another couple of years or so. Meet the Farmers'
Friends. Big thanks to Luke Hemmings, who you can find on Twitter or Instagram at LW Hemmings. Please do head to YouTube to watch the full version of the interview for loads more content on trees. There was probably about another half an hour at least of that interview, so head over there for that. And there are, of course, lots of other Meet the Farmers interviews on there as well. Just search for Meet the Farmers podcast. Next time, I'm thrilled that I'll be speaking to the CEO of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission, and she's also a Monmouthshire farmer, Sue Pritchard. She'll be on the podcast. Until then, have a great week, and I'll see you next time.